What follows is a brief construction montage. Late again.
2 to 3 days later.
Flashback. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
80,000 years later.
That's it. You asked for it. End of flashback.
A ton of where will my feet take me today? Later.
Where will my feet take me today?
Be quiet.
20 jump scares later.
Soon after. Montage.
7,000 weeks later.
Previously. Yesterday. Meanwhile,
Meanwhile in Ulacity.
Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the Lola.
A few moments later.
Moments later. More moments later. Many unbearable moments later. A little later.
Later.
Later. In the void.
Later that same evening.
Later that night.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday. You get the idea. Just then, by sheer coincidence.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute 37 seconds later. 2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Many minutes later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later.
6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later.
8 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. 10 hours later. Several song-filled hours later. Many hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
Tomorrow for sure.
24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early the next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next. The next morning.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The following day.
Tomorrow.
The very next evening.
Day 2.
48 hours later. 2 days later.
Day 3.
72 hours later.
3 days later.
3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later.
Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
Several days later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 weekend of pampering later. 2 weeks later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 3 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
Several months later.
Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5 million years later.
1 eternity later. Opening night. A lot of boring math later. Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later. 1 semester later. 1 season later. 8 semesters later. 1 debt to society later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 1 little boost to the surface later. 1 pathetic sob story later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later. 1 shift later. 1 shift later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 wiener later. 1 nap later. 1 pair of pants later. 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. 82 kilometers later. 298 frozen patties later.
861 millenniums later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. Thousands of tears later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later.
Millions of years later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later.
Eventually.
Several bad puns later.
Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue.